Hello, you are listening to an archived worship service of First Presbyterian Church, Columbus, Mississippi. Thank you for listening.
These words come from Luke's Gospel, chapter 4, verses 21 through 30. Then Jesus began to say to them, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. They said, "Is this not Joseph's son?" He said to them, "Doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, 'Doctor, cure yourself.' And you will say, 'Do here also in your hometown the things that we have heard you did at Capernaum.' And Jesus said, 'Truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown. But the truth is, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah, when the heavens were shut up for 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine over all the land. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them except to a widow at Zarephath in Sidon. There was also many lepers in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed except for Naaman the Syrian. And when they heard this, all in the synagogue were filled with rage. They got up, they drove him out of the town, and they led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they may hurl him off the cliff. But he passed through the midst of them, and he went on his way. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Before I was old enough to sit still and watch a whole movie, before my parents let me watch those old westerns that came on TBS and WGN, I had the Looney Tunes. I bet you did too. So, it was Bugs Bunny and it was Elmer Fudd that first introduced me to the conflict paradigm that became synonymous with the dusty main streets and the archetypal saloons where tough men would stand nose to nose with each other and say, "This town's not big enough for the both of us." Now, as soon as those words were spoken, violence always ensued. Somebody breaks a bottle, card tables get flipped over while the piano plays on for some weird reason, or there's a scene that happens outside, those tense moments at high noon with the itchy, twitchy trigger finger at the holster, ready to go. I just guess that in cartoon towns and in the Old West, towns were just not big enough for Bugs Bunny, Elmer Fudd, John Wayne, or any of them to live peaceably with one another. Today, Luke gives us a peek into a small town that's just a little too small. Everything was going great. Amazed and excited. The people were loving having the hometown boy back. He had done well. He'd gone off. He was coming home. He did his part. He did exactly right. And he made them all enthusiastic by reading those scripture readings from Isaiah, the ones that said, hope is here today. Hope for those who had been trampled on. Hope for those who are poor in spirit. Hope for those who've been widowed or orphaned. Hope for everyone who's been mistreated. Today That scripture is being fulfilled in your hearing," Jesus said. Everything was great. The people of Nazareth were excited, but that all came to an end. That all came to an end when Jesus kept speaking. They all came out to see if what they heard was true. They all had come out to see with their own eyes, because the rumors had spread all throughout the countryside. Could this really be Joseph's son, they asked. Jesus felt all the excitement, all their expectation, all of their relief, and all of their pride. But he also knew their error, their assumption, their miscalculation, and he knew well their fear. Now, Jesus does what very few seldom do in these kind of moments of clarity. He points out a hard truth. He doesn't soften the blow at all, and he moves almost impatiently, blurting out what is truth. I know what you're going to say. I know what you want to hear. You want me to say that everything will be better from now on. No more sick, no more pain, no more insecurity, no more being marginalized, no more fear or suffering or grief. You want me to say that Nazareth will be the center. You want me to say that you'll be most blessed, that I will stay here and tend to you first and foremost. Well, you want me to say that, but that's not true, Jesus says. Christ's message will not stay contained, no matter how much the hometown folks want that to be true. God's love can never simply be domesticated, even by the hometown crowd. Jesus reminds them that it has never been that way, nor will it be now in Him. He tells them two stories that for us may just be like water off our back. We may not understand what's at stake in the two stories that Jesus tells. But Elijah the prophet, ministered to a widow outside of town. One who came from a different town, so to speak. Elisha healed a commander in the other town's army. You know, the bad guy, the enemy. Jesus' words, his two references, strike at the people's greatest insecurity. The people of Nazareth had largely been overlooked by the people of Galilee. They had all but been forgotten by the people of Judea. And now Jesus says what they take it to mean, that they are less significant to God than the stranger, than the other, or even the enemy. Now they are outraged by this notion, and they violently jump to action. This town is not big enough for you anymore. Rather than consider Christ's truth to be good news, they reject Him to the point of death. Now, the Christian writer Leonard Sweet makes a distinction that I think will be helpful for us in the church today to hear. He says that the currency of the gospel of religion, so the currency of the gospel of religion is fear and imposition. The currency of the gospel of Christ is love and invitation. Fear immediately grips the people of Nazareth because they are working in the currency of religion. Fear immediately grips them and it moves them into places of danger and harm. Dread and anxiety tell them that now that the door is open, they will be forgotten all over again. Fear and dread tell them that the gate is now too wide for them to ever be remembered as God's people. Instead of creating a town big enough, they fear one of their own. This past week, North Mississippi paid its last respects to a prophet of sorts. It was a few years ago that a family friend of mine gave me the biography of Jack Reed Sr. Many of you know the story of Jack Reed. I bet you many of you in this place knew him. He was a family friend of my grandfather's, and they knew that I did not know him, and so they wanted to pass some of the stories on. Now, I could not find that book this week, which means maybe one of y'all have it. I would really like to see that book back. But I remember reading this book, and I remember that the narratives were not nearly as interesting to me as were the speeches that he gave in the 1960s. Now, at his funeral yesterday, former Governor William Winter remarked about one of those speeches in particular that I remember reading, a speech that he gave before the Mississippi Economic Council in 1963. Governor Winter called that a watershed moment in civil rights. Now, the biographer remembered things from a different side. He remembered not the things that are celebrated at funerals, but the cost that is taken at the moment. He said that that speech cost him dearly. Many broken relationships, many lost customers, many who showed fear in this time, and said that the town was just simply not big enough. Not big enough for what Governor Winter called, quote, his spirit of Christian love and concern. Now, many of these broken relationships, many of these fears still linger. They live on. And I'm afraid they have outlived Jack Reed Sr., and I'm afraid they're going to outlive a great many of us. It seems that the population of Nazareth is still alive and well. Their voices are in my head, in our heads, that tell us to hold on too tightly in an attempt to make God ours and not theirs. It's the indifference we sometimes feel towards those who do not pray like us or pray at all. It's the indifference that we sometimes feel towards those who do not believe like us or believe at all. The same with those who fight with us, or at worst, fight against us. Do you feel that? That little twinge of uncertainty? Now you feel what the people of Nazareth felt when he said, I'm going to the widow over there. I'm going to the general over there. Do you understand where the anger comes from? Do you understand where the hurt comes from in this passage? We all have that Nazarene impulse to discard rather than accept the hardest teachings of Jesus. We all have that within us. Jesus came for the people of Nazareth. He wouldn't have been there if he hadn't. But he also came for the widow at Zarephath. And he came for Galilee. And he came for the Syrian. He came for the Jew and the Gentile, for the slave and the free, for the broken and the whole, for the lost and the found. It seems like Jesus is the messenger of and, the conjunction. And always takes us to the edge. And always takes us over that edge to places we are not comfortable with. And that is the discomfort that we hear in our story today in Luke's gospel. God's and is bigger than we want to believe. And we are, after all, part Nazarene. And means we will never get a town that's too small. So our epiphany for today is the answer to this question. How can we live in a town that is big enough? One with no brawling saloon. One whose main street at high noon does not have itchy trigger fingers. One that does not lift up fear, but love, not imposition, but hospitality. How will we live in a town big enough? Let us not meet the gospel of Jesus with hostility or violence. Our prayer for Epiphany this day is that we will hear the gospel of Christ with hope and faith.